Kit Knightly, thank you for joining me in the trenches. I was just saying, we spoke a few years ago, and a lot has happened. But I sometimes wonder if we just constantly say that, if a lot is constantly happening, are we just aware of it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, in some ways, a lot have happened, and in some ways, sort of like it's been sort of just caught in like a lot has been said to happen. Like certainly, there's a lot of hyperactivity, a lot of like panic, a lot of hysteria, a lot of this is the worst thing ever kind of going on. But in terms of what's actually happened, it's been, relatively stable, compared to when we last talked.
For my UK column audience who might not know you, just quickly, what is your background, Kit?
Well, background is an interesting question. I don't really have much of a background. My job is running the website OffGuardian.org, where I am the editor and, I'm a contributing editor there, basically. My background isn't in journalism at all. My background was in just writing, and then the world went mad, and that was what I had to write about. So.
But you make an interesting point there. You say your background is not in journalism, but that implies that you need to go and study at a tertiary institution.
Exactly that. She's buying into the idea that journalists are some sort of special class of people that need to be trained, when they're not, obviously. And indeed, it goes back to education and stuff, where they sort of try and funnel you into like specialities very early. But the idea that your life is basically decided for you when you choose what you're going to study at university, if not what you choose to study at A-level, or like.
The idea of school, you spend, 10, 12 years becoming equipped to, become a waiter?
Well, depending what you choose as your speciality. If you're going to choose, like, a PhD in, like, gendered psychology, then, you're probably going to end up being a waiter.
Well, no, I mean actual school, like when you're a kid.
Oh, yeah. Well, there is that, too. The whole education system is very confusing and it's become very I don't want to say slave campy, but I don't know what else to say. It is very sort of. Here, for example, we're getting rambling off on a tangent already, but like in the UK now, you can't take your kids out of school without a doctor's note, and if you do, it can technically be a criminal offence, and they will fine you and stuff like that. And that is different from when I was at school just a few years ago. You could just phone in and say you weren't going, and there's nothing anybody could do about it.
What you just said there now made me realize, with all the chaos of living on the African continent, which I do, there is sometimes a sense of freedom. A lot of kids here just simply don't go to school.
Well, yeah, I suppose, like, yeah, no, there's like a juggling act between like chaos and freedom, isn't it? That's the nature of anarchy versus government, is like, what do you need and what do you not need?
Yeah, but that whole idea of anarchy also, is sort of, it's very ideological also.
Well, everything has become that. Everything has become like, I'm sure the social media is full of anarchists arguing with each other about who is a good anarchist and who is a bad anarchist, and how could you possibly endorse that if you say you're an anarchist, and that kind of thing.
It's all ridiculous. Going back to OffGuardian, the name came about because you and one or two others kept getting kicked off Guardian, the actual The Guardian newspaper's website. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I can't take any credit for the name or even the creation of the website, honestly. That happened before I got there. But the original founding editors, there were 5 or 6 of them, were all commenting on the Guardian in 2014 and 15, mainly because of the situation in Ukraine at the time. And they kept getting banned or kept getting their comments edited. So OffGuardian started out as a place where they could simply publish the comments that the Guardian wouldn't publish. And then that existed for a few months before I was asked to come and help. And then we started publishing articles. And then I wrote an article in May of 2015, which was the first one I'd ever written for OffGuardian. And then suddenly we stopped being about comments and started being about articles. And it just it is now The only real connection to The Guardian is now the name, which I am fine with, because it means I don't have to read The Guardian anymore.
I stumbled across OffGuardian, yes, around about that Ukraine time. And I was just speaking to some other guys earlier, the whole idea of skin in the game. And one of the things that really appealed to me about OffGuardian, and I suppose independent alternative media in general, and I'll come back to that term also in a moment because I want your opinion on that. But what appealed to me about OffGuardian is the contributors had skin in the game, or they at least appeared to have skin in the game, which is a concept that I read in Nassim Taleb's work, who weirdly got everything wrong in the COVID era. But the risk analysis idea that he presented was, take a look at the people who are making claims and see how much they have to lose. And it was quite obvious to me that those at OffGuardian had a lot more to lose than those at the BBC or CNN, for example. And that helped me kind of discern between who to put more faith in.
Well, it depends what you mean by what to lose, because you say the wrong thing at the BBC and you lose like 60,000 a year in a pension, and you say something we don't like at OffGuardian, there's nothing anybody can do about it. So, like, yeah, we have, like, I suppose we are more like emotionally and morally invested in doing the right thing, but we have a lot less to lose in terms of like social status and monetary rewards and like that kind of thing.
No. What I meant was, so for example, if the BBC gets it wrong, nothing happens to the BBC. But if you guys,
I know what you meant. I was just joking. But yeah, I mean, alternative media in general are held to much higher standards in that kind of thing, especially with the passing of things like the Online Safety Act, which means they will come after websites like that.
The term alternative or independent media has also become quite fashionable in the last few years, and I wonder if it falls victim to the same problems as mainstream media, and how do we differentiate between these different schools of thinking?
Well, increasingly, you can't, honestly. And I think, I mean, there's like a greater thesis to be had about the COVID era, the COVID launch, what it achieved, what it didn't achieve, and the like impacts it had on everything. But I think one of the greatest impacts it had was on the media landscape, in the failures of COVID as an agenda were entirely down to what we would have called then the alternate media. And I don't know it's now sort of the alternate media, because the backlash of that has been a sort of co-opting and colonization of that idea and that term by taking like mainstream voices and putting them in like made up, look at this homie studio, he's just a guy doing a podcast from his living room, and having them broadcast on Twitter instead of on CNN. But still very much, they're like co-opting the idea of alternate. And that's the most interesting thing going on in the alternate media sphere, really, is like people like Lemon from CNN and Tucker Carlson getting huge broadcast audiences, and notionally is independent from their old studios, when, you know, you could argue they're very definitely not.
Yeah, and I mean, quite obviously, they end up limiting access to certain information that they could have, but don't want to distribute it.
Yes, and taking up leadership positions against people, with people, for people who have been alienated from the old way of doing media. Like, there is a whole, just millions of people who don't watch CNN and don't read, you know, the Telegraph or the Guardian or New York Times, because why the hell should they? And you know, more power to them. But these are people who are waiting for an information vacuum, and like there has been a deliberate effort to sort of install people at their head to make sure they don't go too far the other way.
I mean, you look at somebody like Joe Rogan. I mean, would he be considered mainstream? I almost want to say yes.
All right, $250 million from Spotify. If $250 million doesn't get you to mainstream, then nothing will.
But he does cover topics here and there that the BBC or CNN won't cover.
Yeah, I mean, and there is a lot of. I mean, he has contributed to the conversation. That is the trick, because it's not a question of simply like these people are all co-opted, they all are knowingly liars spreading an agenda. It doesn't work like that. I mean, most people, even people who work for the New York Times, they don't see themselves as like an owned asset. And Joe Rogan has had good guests on, and he does say some interesting things. But the very nature of accepting that kind of money and the very nature of being in that position means you are liable to control you don't realize is control. And that's the nature of like institutions in general.
You're sort of touching on a theme that I spoke to you originally about a few years ago, and that is sort of the fake binary, the false dichotomy aspect. And it was so profound. It really changed the way that I thought about things going forward. And even the media itself, from mainstream to alternative, faces that same issue of the fake binary.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, this is something, to give credit where credit is due, this is something that my co-editor, Kat Black, came up with back in late 2021, early 2022. And it's not a brand new idea, the idea of controlled opposition that, limits the conversation. But there was very definitely a violent and sudden push towards basically turning every issue into a bipartisan issue. There is basically, if you see COVID as being the greatest act of media consensus that I've ever seen, like I don't think many people would disagree with that. Like every government, every media outlet basically agreed about COVID. And there was a natural reaction to that. People pulled back from it because certitude is sort of like, that kind of weight of opinion makes people like want to explore an alternative. And I think there is since then, regarding first vaccines, then Ukraine and so on, there was a bipartisan shift. From now on, we're not going to do one voice saying one message. We're going to do two voices saying two messages that share the same underlying opinions and therefore limit what you can and cannot think. And that basically, unfortunately, everything can be drawn into that.
I think it was Noam Chomsky. Do I have his quote in front of me? The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum. That was from Chomsky.
Chomsky was absolutely right, which is a very confusing and like conflicting opinion position to be in, because Chomsky was also wrong all the time, and in some ways a very good example of that kind of thing, because he would shut down quite intellectually dishonestly for such a smart man. He would shut down talk about 9/11, he would shut down talk about JFK. I don't actually remember. I think he was pro COVID vaccines. I don't remember. I'm going to have to check that, but I'm pretty sure he was. He was very definitely like a gatekeeper on certain positions.
But that quote still rings true.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you think about it, right? So let's just look at the theater of U.S. politics, right? So you under the Biden administration, you had this pandemic. It's this deadly virus. It's come from a bat from a wet market. Under the Trump administration, there was this deadly pandemic, but it comes from a lab leak. But both camps are arguing the same thing, that there was a deadly pandemic.
Yes, exactly. It's the best example we have, because it's the most obvious example we have of that. Like, okay, well, here's the baseline. This is what is true, and you can argue about the decoration on top of that if you want. And it's in some ways it roots back to the US, to the US's very tightly controlled two-party system, in which both parties argue vociferously about incredibly minute details of policies when they basically support the same exact thing. And that's been going on in America for a long time.
The uniparty idea.
Yeah, they exported that to basically everything. I suppose
you could the same in the UK?
More or less. Except we're in a sort of a moment of like change in the UK, because I think as much as we are going to do the two-party thing that we always do, I honestly think they might be preparing to dump the Conservatives and have Reform take over as the other party. How and why that happens, I'm not sure, but I think it might.
But there's another false dichotomy: a liberal and a conservative, for example. Like, what do these terms even mean? What
literally almost nothing. Like, it's just basically it's the color of the tie they're wearing, and that's it.
I mean, what if conservatives conserved?
Absolutely, exactly. And what is like, and people will say, and it's very interesting, oh, things are so much better now, Labour in power, but things are exactly the same. Like, they don't change.
I used the COVID example with the Trump and Biden administration. I'm also reminded of under the Obama administration, we had this big issue of climate change, global warming, and it's coming from your cars and your light bulbs. Under the Trump administration, it's a little more nuanced, but there's still global warming, but it's coming from geoengineering and chemtrails. So both camps then are arguing, again, the same thing.
Again, yeah, that is interesting. The global warming agenda in general is in a very interesting place at the moment because it's almost sort of stalled. Like, there is no momentum behind it. Like, just a few years ago, there was talk of climate lockdowns. There was talk of, all these terrible things, trying to relate climate change back to COVID, because if it wasn't for climate change, we wouldn't encounter bats, or just crazy, absolute nonsense ideas. But they were there, and there was some energy behind them. And now, maybe it's because Trump is in power now, so like they're going to take it in a different direction. But I don't know, the climate change doesn't seem to be talked about anything like as much as it was just a couple of years ago. There's a really, really pathetic headline on British News a couple of days ago. Like, you must have noticed everywhere. Like, every June is the hottest June we've had since X. Every summer is the hottest summer we've. They can't even say that this time. The one we got a couple of days ago was that April was the sunniest April we've ever had, not the hottest.
It's the sunniest.
Yes.
What's the metric?
By minutes of sunlight.
How do they measure that?
I don't know, because you can't even take with the absurd thing of average temperatures, where they have temperature stations everywhere and they measure them and then they average them across a country or a nation or a region. But with sun, how can you do that? Who is counting the minutes of sun? What counts as sunny?
Those headlines, Kit, I laugh at, because I live in South Africa and we generally have much higher temperatures on average than the UK. So I'll see something that says really, really scorch of a day in the UK, 25 degrees. And that's a normal day, yeah.
Yeah. And again, they did that. They warned of like a heat wave in early April that went up to 24 degrees. And I have, people that live in America and friends that live in America, and they honestly thought it was a joke. 24 degrees. 20, and that wouldn't even have been a heat wave here a few years ago. It would have been like, it's a really nice April day. It's one of the warmest April days we've had in a while.
And also the graphs, what do you call those diagrams that they use now? They've become more red.
Oh yeah, the weather maps. Weather maps used to be just have bright little suns on and smiley faces, and now like covered in flames. Like, it's going to be 26 degrees again, which means basically you can't go outside or you will die.
Why is the media, it's a singular, I guess, why is the media, the mainstream media, going down this road with everything that is clearly on the wrong side of history?
That's an interesting question. I suppose the most cynical thing is what you would say, simply because, and this is unfortunately the way the media works, because at some point they've been told to. There is a confusion of message, a confusion of agenda, a confusion of purpose, like all over what I would call like the establishment, because I don't know what else to call it, and I don't, the powers that be, whatever you want to call it. It's always difficult to like, but there is, the people in charge are in a floundering position, I believe, which is part of the reason there is this chaotic, contradictory world that we see at the moment. There is in short, to link it back to COVID, we were never supposed to be at this point. By now, we're all supposed to be like tagged and boosted and have our vaccines and our global currency, and that just hasn't worked out. So we're kind of stuck, like somebody revving an engine when the wheels won't turn. Like they are trying to push forward with an agenda that has got no momentum anymore.
The Agenda 2030 idea does seem to be less and less likely anytime soon. Why do you think that is? Is it because of the complex nature of humans?
I'm not sure it's especially complex, to be honest. I think they simply underestimated how smart average people are and how resistant they are to being told what to do. And the nature of resistance. I think a lot of the time we think of resistance and we think of, sci-fi dystopias like the Hunger Games, and we think of like Rebels and Star Wars, but there is a more natural, more passive resistance that basically is the people who see COVID in the headlines, see a sign telling them to mask, and just don't. And it isn't a grand political statement, they're just not interested. And I think in order to move forward with big social change, you need at least some public support. Like, you need a certain threshold of like people who at least believe you a little bit. And I think they underestimated how damning it is and how halting it is to have people simply not believe them passively and independently.
But it's interesting because it does also seem to be linked to culture. If I look at my friends who live in different countries, for example, in Canada, they had a fairly compliant, obedient culture during the COVID era. Here in South Africa, for example, the vaccine uptake was one of the lowest in the world. I think it was less than 2% or something. And that I think is linked to culture. I don't think that's linked to necessarily intelligence, because of the people that I know who did get the jab, they're pretty intelligent.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I was having a conversation with someone about this a little while ago, who mentioned that the three worst COVID countries in some ways were Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they suggested it was because they are like well, not even a former, they are British colonies, so they have like a history of like that kind of dictation. But I actually use South Africa as a counterexample. I mean, South Africa was never along with those three in that way, but is still like a former British protectorate thing. So like it's not that simple. I suppose you could argue like there is a certain amount of like happy, like slightly chubby middle classness in Canada and Australia, a sort of like very comfortable, soft people that doesn't really apply to a lot of other former British places. It was very much a middle class thing. It was. It's certainly true here. It was like you get far more resistance in the working class than in the middle class. I think the most important lesson to learn from COVID, easily the most important, and this spreads out to other things I've written about since, is never ever let the conversation be controlled from an assumption that you haven't tested yourself. Like, for example, and this is not related to COVID, but it's a good example. I recently was having a conversation with a panel of people for the Independent Media Alliance, and somebody flashed up a headline that said, we were talking about AI, and they said, and the headline was, "In the future, AI will be used to write legislation." And the conversation progressed slightly as to what that means. What does AI written legislation mean? But I would say the more important question, and our role as people who sit outside the mainstream, would be to say, is this headline real? Like, this, you have to question underlying assumptions. They might say AI can write legislation, but what that really means is they can say AI can write legislation, which means they can write whatever legislation they want, claim an AI wrote it, and that gives it a veneer of like mechanical, non-partisan unbiasedness. It's automatically fair because a machine wrote it. And I think COVID should have taught that to lots of people. You never believe the statement of a headline, you question the statement of a headline. Also should teach people that like, and this is something we've been talking about on OffGuardian for a long time, and COVID really should have brought it home. The media can just be made up. Like, they do make things up. Like, it isn't a question of like they're publishing a real study. Studies can be made up. It isn't a question of a real photograph. Like, there is a shocking amount of simply false information just said, and the machinery relies on a certain amount of like resistance in people to accept that a headline can simply be a lie, that a research paper can be made up, that a photo can be AI generated, and that kind of thing. And I think that is the most important lesson we all should learn, is that the reality the media presents is not reality, potentially.
So the South African president met with Donald Trump in the White House, and they spoke about white genocide. Now I, as somebody who lives here, just saw a whole pile of theatre happening there in the Oval Office. All over the world, mainstream media and independent alternative media are talking about all these various aspects of genocide, and now it all comes down to a distraction. What does the word genocide mean? And now suddenly, any of those actual issues that might actually be rooted in some reality are not being spoken about, because now we're discussing genocide, and we're discussing other distractions, and at the same time, you've now got Elon Musk now rolling out more mass surveillance via Starlink, which is now entering South Africa as a result of that meeting. So if you are quite cynical, you would immediately start joining some dots there, which
absolutely, yeah,
people aren't doing.
Like it changes the conversation to be about what genocide means, and suddenly everything that isn't genocide is all right. Like I saw people defending the situation in South Africa, saying, well, it's not genocide, it is simply a reappropriation of colonized land. And I was quite shocked, to be honest, because I don't believe that just because something isn't genocide, it's all right. And I certainly don't believe that we should be normalizing the idea that the government can any government can simply take your private property because they don't believe you morally earned it. It's incredibly dangerous, and it sets an awful precedent, but it normalizes that idea. And having Trump say something to make everybody think it's a lie is a trick that's now 10 years old. They always do it. Trump will endorse something, and everybody will immediately believe the opposite.
When Biden was, in quotation marks, president, it was very obvious that he had no idea what was going on, and there were other people pulling the strings. With Trump being a populist, suddenly he can say, well, we're going to implement digital ID on the border, and his entire support base will just roll with it. Yeah, that's a great idea.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is exactly what we were talking about. They've changed the conversation by putting quote-unquote rebels in the White House, so that every position they take is automatically the rebellious counter-establishment position, even if it's the same position as before. Like, the digital ID is the perfect example, because digital ID is everywhere. It's all over the world. Pretty much every major country I can think of is rolling out their digital ID plan. And they all claim it's for different reasons. Donald Trump is doing it to secure the border, and the EU is doing it to facilitate vaccine passes across borders, and so that kind of thing. They're securing elections. They're preventing foreign interference. It's all that kind of thing.
But it's still digital ID.
It's still digital ID across the board, and it will be, of course, it will be what's the word? They always use the word. I've written this word down a million times and I don't remember what it is. It will be. They will work together. The different digital ID systems will. This is really.
They will be centralized. They'll be synchronized.
They'll be synchronized. There'll be one big system, in 50 different names. Cross-border compatibility is one way they put it. Interoperable. That's the word they always use.
Interoperable.
That's the word they always use for digital currencies. We're all going to have our own digital currency, the digital pound, the digital dollar, the digital euro, but they'll be interoperable across borders. So if we want to have one global currency.
During the COVID years, I felt like there was also this, I hate saying this word, but I felt like there was an awakening of people around me. Trump came in and I feel like it's just all gone.
Absolutely. Yeah, they have worked to split and satiate and comfort what was a massive sort of cross-party, cross-partisan, left, right, up, down, anarchists, liberals, whatever. There was a massive, massive pushback that they have factionalized and split up and diverted with various topics, since Trump is one of the biggest. Ukraine was probably the most effective Because in going back to a war that was, 7 years out of date by 2022, they broke off an awful lot of anti-COVID, anti-establishment thinking to take up a pro-Russia position. But that's very awkward because Russia is pro-digital ideas, pro-digital currency, had its own COVID, vaccines. Well, if even supposing that Russia's geopolitical clashes with the West are entirely sincere and entirely ideological, they don't have the best interests of their own people at heart. That's been demonstrated. And they don't have the best interests of the world in general at heart. So why is that a position to take up? But that's split an awful lot of people who, traditional anti-NATO, anti-West people wanted a rallying point, and they used the Russia-Ukraine war as that, and that split the COVID movement. That split it right down the middle. And then Trump and Biden split it again. It did. There are groups and email chains of various different people that just disappeared overnight. I was in a lot of them, and they're just gone.
Smart or dumb? What do you think it is?
I think it was the result of a very human and very understandable want and need to return to a comfortable world that isn't, by comfortable, I don't mean padded, I mean one in which you understand what's going on, a dynamic you understand. We do that. People regress. It's like when you go back to your old childhood home and you suddenly start acting like a teenager again. You can't help it. You meet children, you meet people you went to school with, and you start talking like when you were at school. And I think there was a pull of that. There was, okay, Russia good guys, America bad guys. I know how this works. This is something I don't have to worry about. This isn't world changing. We can get back into doing this the old-fashioned way. I think there was a massive appeal of that.
Yeah, Matthias Desmet spoke about it. He used the term mass formation or whatever. It doesn't really matter what the terminology is, but he was effectively saying that around 30% of people at any given time will stay with their eyes wide open, and the rest will probably not. And I kind of see that in my circles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is that a critical mass, though? 30%?
I don't know. It's in some ways, it's sort of the inverse. I think there's something I've always found very interesting is there's an American research team that have done, I forget what university it was, that did nationwide polls on the JFK assassination, basically every year since it happened, on if they believe Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. And this is kind of a tangent, but you'll see where I'm going. And in every single one of those polls, at least 60% of people said they didn't believe the official story. The people that believed the official story topped out at about 36-37%. And yet that is sort of officially true. I think that it's interesting that an opinion held by 2/3 of the population is considered a minority opinion. So in some ways, the 30%, I think, is the critical mass they require in order to sell, and they need about 30% of people to believe them. And I don't know why that would be the number, but it does seem to be, because that number holds up with 9/11 as well, and lots of other things.
I wonder if it's supposed to be like that, because imagine if it was 100%. I think we'd have a very strange society.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a type of glue. It's like a type of glue that just keeps things in some degree of order.
Yeah, Unfortunately, that's just baked in. That's people going back thousands and thousands of years. That's, the people that wept when Julius Caesar died and that kind of thing. That's just the nature of things. People like to have their leaders and their kings, and they weaponize that, definitely. Like the media likes to try and anoint one. They're doing it in Canada right now with Mark Carney. Mark Carney's had this amazing political, rise out of nowhere. He was just the guy that ran the central bank, and now suddenly he's this nerdy dad that's going to just stand up to Trump and make Canada amazing. And I'm seeing it work, which is dispiriting, but like...
Somebody listening to this right now might say, yeah, but Kit, you sound very black-pilled, ultra cynical. Do you see any light at the end of the tunnel? Is there a way out?
I suppose, I don't know, I feel like I've answered this question a lot. I suppose I am very cynical, but I'm not black-pilled because I'm cynical about the mechanisms of institutions, but I'm not cynical about people. And I think what we already talked about with regards to that, there was a massive awakening with COVID, and it wasn't because anybody got up on a soapbox and started preaching. It was just a massive, it was a revolution of 1 million people all happening inside 1 million heads individually at the same time. And I think that is the safeguard of society in general. I think there will come a point at any given time where people simply don't go as far as they need to make the world an unsavable place. I think it could have happened in COVID, and it didn't. And as much as alternate media people, and I would love to take credit for that, I don't think that we served a bit of a function. But I think, generally speaking, people are going to do the right thing eventually. That is, and I don't believe that to be a cynical or black-pilled thing. I mean, I will cop to being black-pilled about lots. But I think, generally speaking, most people are all right most of the time. And so society can't get too bad without that just automatically pushing back. I would also say I take more optimism from what I would call a general feeling in power circles that their eyes are always bigger than their stomachs. They want more than they can possibly have. Their reach exceeds their grasp. However you want to say it, they try for things they can't get. They have a natural limitation of psychopathic detachment, a natural limitation of overarching ambition that means they fall. Like an example I go back to all the time, you're probably familiar with it, is the General Wesley Clark, the memo. He said, we're going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. And everybody talks about that, but what very few people talk about is the fact that they didn't. They tried to, and they invaded eventually 6 countries in 12 years, and 3 of them didn't work out very well. So I think that's where you take optimism from. Yeah, things will work out just naturally.
Do you think that the machine, the establishment, is well oiled, or do you think it's fairly broken and has many competing parts within it?
It has competing parts. It has climbing parts. It's like a swarm of rats. They're all running in the same direction, and it gives the illusion of like unity of purpose. But they're just rats, and they're climbing over each other to get to the front. Unfortunately, this is the limitation. Not unfortunately, fortunately, this is the limitation of dystopian and authoritarian and tyrannical governments, is that they employ people who are not good people, and therefore they are not ideologically loyal. They are loyal to themselves, and that creates factions. It creates cracks. There is as I was just talking about with the Ukraine thing, there was a general feeling in lots of people, I think millions of people, are sort of like, they want to get back to normal. And that has aided in a sort of general like amnesia about what COVID was like. I suppose it's like, I mean, to use a pretty bleak metaphor, it's like an abusive relationship. Like,
what do you think, Kit, is the most optimal way to look at the world around us?
Embracing, I suppose, 2 things, really. Embracing the idea of what Edmund Burke called the little platoons, which is like your direct connections, your families. Basically, essentially, the units of your life should be things you directly interact with. Your community. He uses church, but that's obviously slightly out of date in our secular world. But churches, communities, families, and focusing on the fact that those are real things. And everything you see outside that, and this is, I think, the most important thing anybody can think at this current time, the most important thing you can think is that anything you see on a TV, anything you read on a newspaper, anything you see on the internet could and possibly will be entirely made up. And as long as you always analyze things from that point of view, as long as you keep in the back of your head that voice saying, yeah, but that might not be true, I think you'll be all right. It's when you start accepting the idea that anything on a screen is real that they'll have you like in the palm of their hand, basically. They can just show you stuff and you'll react.
I think that's quite a pragmatic approach also, because you're setting the bar quite low.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I was thinking about how one filters through all these things, and another way of looking at it is also simply not to look at it.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, my livelihood depends on it. But if it didn't, I would consume much less of the whole news media cycle than I do. I think it's far healthier.
That's another interesting point, though, because people tend to be consumers of sensation and hysteria.
Yeah. Although, I mean, there are questions about that even now, like how much of the internet is even real people anymore? I mean, what do they call the empty internet theory? Vast amounts of it is just bots and AI profiles, and an awful lot of reactions are bots and AI profiles. Like, you don't really know. I think more people than you'd think simply disengage.
And the other thing also is, and it's a trap that people constantly fall into, and we were alluding to this earlier, but it's the invisible boogeyman, idea that the things you can't see are the worst threats, like AI, pandemics, global warming, what's another one? Nuclear war. And these are really, really strong control mechanisms.
Yeah, they are the big things to be afraid of, but in some ways, and I think COVID and everything, the more worthy things to be afraid of are the smaller things. The rules about owning chickens and the licensing for weapons or cars or anything, just the sheer amount of regulation being poured into people's lives in small ways. Like, I think that's a far more appropriate thing to worry about.
Would you go back to 2019?
Would I go back to 2019? That is an interesting point. Would I? I don't think that would achieve anything. No. If anything, in fact, I actually prize a lot of the new ideas and increased cynicism I've acquired since then. Like, I think COVID was actually in some ways not a bad thing, and I you won't hear many people say that, but I think it was beautifully, ironically, it was a mask-off moment for the way the world works. And I think a lot of people realize that. And there's some denial, there's some people who want to go back, people pretend it didn't happen. But generally speaking, more people now understand the way the world works than they did before. And I would even include myself in that.
I wonder what will happen 100 years from now, Kit. Are people going to look back at us and go, you bunch of utter idiots?
I don't know. Because 100 years from now, they're like, we look back, for example, at the JFK things, and we say, man, those people fell for it. They did the JFK thing and people just fell for it because the official record says they did. But if you look at the opinion polls, then they didn't. So, like, who's to say exactly how we all look? Because the records will show, for example, 88% vaccine uptake in the UK. And even
that
I think that number's made up. Yes, I mean, yes. Obviously, like just as they like say, oh, there's this many cases because a case is anybody that tests positive. Probably vaccine uptake is anybody that like put their name down on a form as having been vaccinated or expressed interest in a vaccine or that kind of thing. But, they work statistics to get the result they want. But the official thing will say 88% vaccine uptake. So who's to say how people, and that would make us look silly, but I think the real number is much lower than that. So who's to say how people will see us?
Here we have quite literally millions of people from the apartheid era living in squalor. They live in tightly packed tin homes with maybe 6-8 people in one of them, all right next to each other and on top of each other, right? Our headlines were running, experts baffled as to why COVID doesn't seem to be spreading, because now a deadly contagion should be wiping them out, you know?
Yeah.
And it wasn't happening. And so then you have these billboards going up saying that there's a deadly pandemic, because if you don't see it, you need to see it on a billboard.
Exactly.
And the airports are telling you, but you're not seeing it.
Exactly. I mean, that was one of the most interesting things, is that Africa is like in general, is one of the greatest, and there was no pandemic argument, because Africa supposedly has 50 million AIDS patients on it. And you'd think a deadly pandemic would have simply wiped the place out. It would be done. But no, they had to do that everywhere. They had to basically tell people it was there and show people it was there without it ever being there. It was very, very interesting. That's part of the reason that masks were so important psychologically, is if you see people walking around with masks, immediately your brain starts thinking, well, there must be a reason they're doing that. That's the reason they really did push the masks hard, is that it makes it look like something is happening when it isn't. They built, in this country, they built a whole bunch of emergency hospitals, the Nightingale hospitals, that were never used. We need them desperately. In fact, I mean, this is one of the most perverse things, and it's very interesting. They had to spread on COVID wards. They had to make space, obviously, because you need more space because of, social distancing. So they had to take beds out. They took beds out so they could put beds further apart. And still the hospitals didn't get full. They reduced, they actually, unironically, reduced hospital capacity during a deadly pandemic. And they said this was for a good reason. And not only does that mad, but they still didn't end up with full hospitals.
You said social distancing, and there's something that also kind of broke my brain a little bit. I had never heard the term social distancing before the year 2020.
It's not because they made it up. That term what does it even mean? Social distancing. You just mean stand further apart. But they drilled it into people's heads, and now that's a thing.
But it's just a coincidence, Kit, that every country in the world was using the same wording.
Yeah. There was probably some memo from the WHO back in 2018 that first used it or something.
Interestingly, you said that the term was made up. There's a movie that I stumbled across during the COVID era called Contagion. It came out in 2012.
Yeah, Matt Damon, Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yes,
right.
And they used the term social distancing in it.
Yeah, you can talk for hours about the weird predictive things in Hollywood movies and TV series in general, and whether, to get into a weird area, whether that just sort of happens by accident because of the weight of an idea or something, it sort of echoes, or whether it is deliberately put there, what they call predictive programming. You can never know. But in the pilot episode of a TV series called The Lone Gunman, which was a spin-off of The X-Files, the government hijacks a passenger plane to try and crash it into the World Trade Center.
No, when was this?
In order to start, that aired in, I believe, late 2000, early 2001. It aired just a few months before 9/11. It's crazy that happened. I mean, it's so crazy that people think about it just have to stop thinking about it, because what does it mean? It potentially means nothing, and it also potentially means everything. Why would they do that? Or did it happen just organically? It poses all sorts of weird questions.
Fellow cartoonist and friend Bob Moran, who I think you might know, he made a great comment a while back. He said he approaches everything as if it's satire. Laugh first at it, because it certainly helps one's sanity. But he added that the problem with that is that most people don't see it as laughable, and that feeds into now what you were saying earlier, that the gullibility aspect or the asleep aspect becomes quite evident again. And so it's almost as though we need these cycles of big events to snap people out of their slumbers. Yeah.
And honestly, we're sort of overdue for one. But I think there is a reluctance to have one, because I think in some ways, as we've talked about, the COVID thing sort of did more harm than good. I think they have floated like the next pandemic 50 times since the last pandemic, monkeypox. I forget what the others have been. It doesn't matter. But they're always floating the next pandemic. But I think there is a reluctance to launch something like that because they're afraid of reigniting what they just spent years putting down. But yeah, the cycles of big events has always been the way things have gone.
Who's they?
Well, yeah. Unfortunately, there's no simple answer to that question. Like, there is it's almost a set of machinery rather than a set of people. Like, Klaus Schwab is retiring, for example, and he was like a boogeyman for but I never believed that Klaus Schwab was in charge. I never believed they would have a big meeting and sit around and Klaus Schwab would bang his gavel on the table and talk about how they were going to try and take over the world. It doesn't work that way. There's a sort of interconnected network of institutions, really, machinery, wheels turning, that push some people up to the top briefly, but then swallow them back up again when they're no longer useful. There is a constructed organism, factory, whatever, whose simple aim is to acquire control and power in whatever form. And it does that the only way it knows how. It can't do anything else. So maybe they isn't the right term, but you've struggled to think of synonyms.
The
establishment.
Give me a nugget of wisdom.
The most useful nugget of wisdom I've acquired in doing OffGuardian would be the simple assertion that whenever you see anything in the news, you say to yourself, why this and why now? And that encompasses questions of fakeness or forgery or reality or otherwise. But it also makes that not important, because something can be true but only presented because it is serving an agenda. So why this, why now? It's just a good mindset to get into. Why this, why now, whenever you see anything. I think it's the most important thing.
I like that. Kit, how can I follow you?
Well, you can follow OffGuardian on Twitter or X. OffGuardian 0, because there was already an OffGuardian. It's complicated. And you can read all our output at off-guardian.org. And that's basically it.
Are you yourself? Are you on Twitter X?
Oh, I am. Yeah. I get OffGuardian subsumed my identity. I never even think about it. Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Kit Knightly. Yeah, I'm about. I get published at OffGuardian, but other places pick me up sometimes. So you might see me in The Light, or you might see me on other places.
Just quickly, I don't know about you, but I struggle to say X.
No, can't. I will say Twitter every single time, probably until the day I die.
I mean, how can you call something a letter, just a single letter?
Yeah,
it's ridiculous.
It doesn't make any sense. And it's also kind of presumptuous, because X can mean so many other things. He's taken the unknown quantity and branded it, which isn't fair.
Kit Knightly, thank you for joining me in the trenches.